In fantasy lore, few creatures inspire such visceral revulsion as the orc and the goblin. These twisted malevolent humanoids have become the archetypal villains of modern fantasy, the beastly footsoldiers of evil, ravaging the realms of men and elves with their brutish savagery. From Tolkien's famous accursed and malevolent enemies of all that is good, to the green-skinned hordes swarming across the battlefields of Warhammer and Warcraft, or lurking in the dungeons of D&D, orcs and goblins are universally portrayed as the repulsive antithesis of all that is good and noble in fantasy's heroic knights and wizards. But where did these iconic monster races first emerge from? What primal legends and folklore unleashed such feared and hated abominations into our modern fantasy canon? So let's kick off this episode with an exploration of the origins of our favorite sword fodder. We'll start by unpacking the word orc. There are several theories about the derivation of the word. One of the earliest sources is the Latin word orcus, the name of a Roman god of the underworld and punisher of the unrighteous after death. This aligns with orcs' common characterization as denizens of the dark subterranean realms found within fantasy worlds. Orcus was a terrifying figure who mercilessly tormented wicked souls in the afterlife, not unlike rampaging orc hordes slaughtering their way across the lands of the living. The word orcus also lends its etymological DNA to the Old English term orcneas, meaning demon from hell, or goblin, and it is this Anglo-Saxon origin that prompted J.R.R. Tolkien to use the name. Another Latin candidate is orca, a terrifying aquatic beast that attacked and sank ships, and is where we get the alternative name for killer whales. You can see how this man-eater of the deep could be linked to orcs pillaging and slaughtering coastal settlements. Coastal raiders have of course been a fact of life in many cultures, but in Western Europe it was the Vikings, and earlier sea pirates and raiders from the Iron Age and earlier that would have been responsible for legends such as the Celtic Fomorians, decidedly orc-like raiders from the sea, led by a monstrous warlord called Balor of the Evil Eye. Alternatively, it may be a branch of the ancient Greek orc, meaning obstacle or barrier, characterizing orcs as a symbolic rampart of evil forces. Regardless of the linguistic root, most agree the word emerged from ancient terms representing death, the underworld, and malign forces, forever cementing the perception of orcs as an unholy, primordial enemy of mankind. As for goblins, the origins of these foul enemies lies in European folklore's long tradition of misshapen ugly sprites dwelling in dark dank places like caves and abandoned mines. In medieval French and Anglo-Norman tales, creatures known as goblins or similar variants like gobelins, hobelins, or hobgoblins, all stemmed from the Greek root hobalos meaning trickster sprite. To the superstitious, goblins were impish subterranean fairies given to crude pranks, petty mischiefs, and general nuisance-making. More than just silly household pests, however, goblins were also possessed of a sinister, malicious bent, actively seeking to harm, torment and mislead wayward travelers. These myths reinforced beliefs that goblins were agents of the devil, sent to test one's faith through temptation, greed, and evil whispers in the dark. As such, goblins were as much folkloric representations of moral corruption and the inherent darkness of man, as they were physical manifestations of the inhospitable treacherous wilderness beyond village safety. When authors like J.R.R. Tolkien, and the fantasy gaming worlds of Dungeons & Dragons and Warhammer, later melded goblin lore with the fearsome mythology of orcs, both creatures morphed into a unified race of violent barbaric humanoid. It was J.R.R. Tolkien's groundbreaking Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit novels that truly cemented orcs and goblins as an inseparable, irredeemably evil force in modern fantasy. Throughout Tolkien's rich mythology, orcs are depicted as a fallen breed of elves, cruelly tortured and bred into a state of perpetual violence, hatred and bondage by the first Dark Lord, Morgoth. Whereas the precise origins of Tolkien's orcs are shrouded in some ambiguity, his portrayal of malicious goblins hews closer to their traditional depiction as evil sprites. Within his stories, goblins are seen as a branch species within the greater orc race. Smaller, leaner cousins, who prefer to dwell in subterranean caves and mines, away from sunlight. It is Tolkien who first establishes the lasting convention of goblins being distinct but related to the larger and more brutal breed of orcs we commonly picture. To exemplify this dichotomy between the two races, goblins tend to be conniving, cruel but ultimately cowardly ambushers ready to scatter at signs of serious resistance, whereas orcs are more regimented, whipped into line on the battlefield by the biggest and most aggressive of their kind. One particularly fearsome breed of orc that featured prominently in the Lord of the Rings saga were the Uruk-hai. Bred by the wizard Saruman through foul sorcery, the Uruk-hai were a terrifying race of orcs that amplified the brawn and aggression of Mordor orcs with a higher degree of intelligence and the ability to endure sunlight. Standing nearly man-high, the Uruk-hai acted as Saruman's elite shock troops, their increased cunning making them formidable tactical opponents as well as unstoppable front-line warriors. It was a band of Uruk-hai that ambushed and captured the hobbits Merry and Pippin, as well as spearheading the siege of Helm's Deep, solidifying their reputation as the most redoubtable and feared of Sauron's foul orc legions. Despite some subtle differences though, Tolkien makes abundantly clear that orcs and goblins form a united front of unapologetic evil, avatars of pure malice and moral corruption diametrically opposed to the goodly forces of man, elf and wizard. This polarizing absolute between the factions of light and darkness was a core theme underlying the spiritual, mythic undertones of Tolkien's fantastical writing. This emblematic characterization of orcs and goblins as fantasy's most reviled antagonists was brought viscerally to life in Peter Jackson's blockbuster Lord of the Rings film adaptations. Jackson and his Weta Workshop Effects team painstakingly designed their interpretations of Tolkien's orcs and goblins to be as filthy and twisted as they were described in the books. Gnarled fangs, piggish snouts and beady hate-filled eyes glared out from under battered iron helmets, while their hulking bodies were a matted tangle of scarred skin stretched over wiry muscle. Behind the grunting animalistic snarls lay a debased intelligence capable of cruelty and sadism that added to the sheer menace of these vile creatures in each of Jackson's 3 films. We see orc and goblin cruelty on full display as they torture and devour their own kind without mercy. No instance better exemplified their sheer depravity than the gut-wrenching scene in the Two Towers where Uruk-hai rip apart and cannibalize an unruly goblin scout. Looks like meat's back on the menu. Audiences were left with zero ambiguity that within Jackson's incredible realization of Middle-earth, the marauding orc and goblin hordes were the living embodiment of all that was evil and cruel in this fantasy world, ravenous killing machines driven only by hatred, domination and slaughter. This deeply entrenched archetype of orcs and goblins collectively representing the ultimate antagonists of law, order and morality also proliferated across other major fantasy franchises like Games Workshop's groundbreaking Warhammer universe and Blizzard's wildly popular Warcraft franchise. In Warhammer's Old World, orc and goblin tribes existed in a constant state of internecine tribal warfare, fueled by bloodlust, greed for power, and little ambition beyond killing and pillaging. Every now and again though, a particularly powerful warlord would emerge to unite the tribes by force, and lead them on a devastating rampage against other races, known as a war. In the Warcraft franchise, which was heavily influenced by Warhammer's take on orcs and goblins, creator Blizzard established them as separate but closely related species within the overarching Horde faction. In Blizzard's lore, goblins are classified as offshoots of the dominant orcish bloodlines, smaller, weedier and more technologically inclined cousins, often drafted as attendants and engineers for their larger brethren. Whether it's Warcraft or Warhammer, D&D or Magic the Gathering, the common distinction is that orcs are solidified as the larger, stronger and decidedly more militaristic species of the two, hulking, brutal frontline warriors and shock troops, fanatically devoted to the cause of whichever Dark Lord or Demon Prince leads them. Goblins, on the other hand, are depicted as more subservient but conniving pests, smaller, weaker, yet more innately intelligent and dexterous than their orc cousins. Often employed as scouts, engineers, tinkerers and trap makers, goblin tribes act as devious skirmishers and sappers supporting the unstoppable orcish war parties and incursions. This comprehensive codifying of orcs and goblins into a stark morphological and cultural dichotomy of brutes versus sneaks, essentially cemented these two species as eternal foils and staple threats for countless adventurers and armies of good, to battle across endless quests and campaigns. For the most part within fantasy fiction, orcs and goblins are cast as the go-to disposable goons, faceless cannon fodder for heroes to mow down by the hundreds, without compunction. Their lack of individual identities or backstories, beyond one-note tropes of being evil for evil's sake, made it easy for authors and readers to disassociate and dehumanize these monster races when it came time for bloody conflict. However, as the fantasy genre has evolved, some authors have begun exploring deeper takes that add shades of grey to the classic portrayal of singularly villainous orcs and goblins. Novels like Stan Nichols' Orcs series, written from the viewpoint of the orcs, have taken pains to depict these creatures not as soulless marauding beasts, but rather as complex individuals, subject to tyranny both from within and from their traditional enemies such as humans and dwarves. Even video games like World of Warcraft have attempted to humanize the playable orc and goblin protagonists by providing them with sympathetic, honor-bound characterizations and convoluted backstories that often paint them as the tragic underdogs wronged by external forces. That said, while these revisionist perspectives have allowed for some fresh storytelling perspectives, the enduring appeal of orcs and goblins as fantasy's most despised antagonists remains a core part of their iconic status and longevity. There's an innate thrill to seeing these grotesque humanoid forms crushed by a hero's broadsword or fireballed into greasy cinders by a wizard's spell. Ultimately, whether portrayed with nuanced shades of grey, or should that be green, or not, orcs and goblins will doubtless remain deeply entrenched as the dark legions of fantasy fiction for generations to come. Their very names have become shorthand for savage inhumanity, a remorseless evil to be exterminated without mercy, giving voice to humanity's perpetual struggle against our own capacity for warlike barbarism and moral corruption.